Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping back to the very edge of an ending, the fall of Rome. Not the triumphant parades of emperors, not the marble cities in their prime, but the years after, when the grandeur had crumbled, and the ordinary people who remained had to find a way to live among the ruins. Imagine waking on a straw bed pressed against the base of a fallen column, the once great stones now nothing more than shelter from the wind. Picture goats wandering through a silent forum, grass pushing through the cracked pavements where senators once stood to argue laws. The aqueducts that once poured water into fountains are broken now, their arches carrying only silence, while families huddle beside hearth fires in the shadows of what remains. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little community come together across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's drift together into a quieter world, a world of broken statues, fading roads, and the fragile endurance of ordinary lives in the long night after Rome. A world of ruins, waking beside broken walls. The first light was not the sharp, golden spear of a Roman dawn, but a diffuse, bruised grey that filtered through the gaping maw of what was once a grand archway. You woke not to the distant clang of an imperial blacksmith or the murmur of a bustling forum, but to the unsettling silence of a world half forgotten, half reclaimed by the wild. Your bed was a thin scattering of straw, damp from the night's creeping chill, laid directly upon the cold, hard, flagging stones that had once formed a noble floor. Above you, an immense, broken wall of grey marble towered, its smooth, cool surface scarred by time, weather, and the blunt force of forgotten conflicts. The grandeur was gone, yet its ghosts remained. You could feel them in the monumental scale of the surviving structures, in the way a fallen column lay like a sleeping giant just beyond your makeshift sleeping spot. Its fluted shaft, once pristine, was now cracked, stained with moss, and served as a convenient resting place for a stray dog that sometimes wandered through the ruins. The air, though thick with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from the nearby hearth, also carried a faint, metallic tang that spoke of age, of rust, of the slow decay of iron. Sleep had been a fitful thing, a grudging surrender to exhaustion. The stones beneath the straw pressed against your weary bones, unforgiving even through the thin layers of your tunic and blanket. The cold, a constant companion, seeped upwards, chilling your very marrow. You dreamt not of triumph or glory, but of the simple, desperate need for warmth, for food, for the quiet reassurance of a roof that didn't let in the elements. Yet even in sleep, the echoes of the place permeated your rest. The way the wind would whisper through a broken mosaic, a sound like a phantom sigh, the distant hoot of an owl nesting in a hollow statue. As consciousness slowly returned, your eyes, accustomed to the profound darkness of your hovel, began to discern the familiar shapes of your immediate world. The rough, patched wool blanket, smelling of sheep and old smoke, the small, earthen pot near the cold embers of the hearth, its outline indistinct against the even deeper shadow. And always, always, the colossal, indifferent presence of the ruins. The way a shattered marble head, eyeless and serene, lay half buried in the tall grass just a few paces from your doorless entry. It was a reminder, if one were needed, of the transience of all things, even empires. Your breath, when you exhaled, plumed faintly in the frigid air, a fragile cloud that quickly dissipated. Even here, nestled within the collapsed remains of what might have once been a wealthy domus or a public basilica, the chill was pervasive. The vast, open spaces of the ruin invited the wind, allowing it to sweep unimpeded through the fractured walls and empty halls. You shivered, pulling the coarse blanket tighter, wishing for a moment that the sun would hasten its ascent. To rise was not a choice, but an inevitability. The demands of the day began even before the light, pressing in with a silent urgency. There was water to fetch, a fire to rekindle, some scraps of food to find. Your muscles protested with a familiar ache, stiff from the cold and the endless labor of yesterday. Every joint felt like a rusty hinge, protesting the simple act of movement. The straw rustled under you, dry and sharp, as you slowly pushed yourself up, a slow, deliberate unfolding of limbs. You sat for a moment, hunched against the lingering chill, letting your eyes adjust further. The sky was still a deep, bruised purple at the very edge of the eastern horizon, hinting at the coming dawn. Here, among the ruins, the horizon felt closer, more immediate, unsoftened by the gentle curves of a settled landscape. It was stark, broken by the jagged silhouettes of once proud structures. A segment of an aqueduct, its massive arches still defying gravity, stood like a skeletal sentinel against the burgeoning light, its purpose long forgotten by most who passed beneath. The ground beneath you was not a finished, cultivated floor, but the compacted earth and rubble of countless centuries. Beneath the thin layer of straw and rushes, you could feel the uneven surfaces of ancient tesserae, fragments of marble, or perhaps even a broken piece of pottery, all testifying to lives lived long ago, under a different sky. Grass pushed through the cracks in the flagstones, tenacious and defiant, blurring the lines between what was built and what was wild. Moss grew in verdant carpets where walls met earth, lending a soft green melancholy to the grey stone. The air carried the distinct unsettling aroma of decay and renewal, the metallic scent of oxidizing iron, the mustiness of damp stone, the faint sweetness of wild herbs growing amongst the rubble. These were the perfumes of a declining world, a world shedding its skin, leaving behind only the most resilient. Your hut was not a true building, but a shelter of convenience, a low, rough wall patched with mud and scavenged timber, leaning against the formidable, unyielding bulk of a ruined Roman structure. Its roof was a hasty affair of thatch and salvaged tiles, prone to leaks, but it was yours for now. It offered a thin, precious barrier against the wind and the watchful, indifferent stars. You could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of your family, still asleep nearby. Your husband, perhaps, his rough hand stretched out in sleep. Your children, small bundles wrapped in rags, their faces obscured by the shadows. Their presence was a constant, quiet comfort, a tether to the living world amidst the monuments to the dead. Their quiet murmurs, their occasional coughs, were the sounds of humanity stubbornly persisting in a landscape that seemed determined to erase it. No rooster crowed here in the heart of these broken stones. Instead, it was the sound of a distant dog or the rustle of a rat in the piles of debris that marked the passage of the deepest night towards dawn. Or perhaps, most reliably, it was simply the innate knowing in your bones, the ancient clock of the body, attuned to the subtle shifts in light and temperature. The sun would rise as it always did, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, and with it, the quiet, persistent struggle to survive would begin anew, another day spent coaxing life from the ruins. You pushed yourself to your feet, the straw clinging to your clothes, a constant, small annoyance. The vast, cool, silent presence of the broken walls surrounded you. They were a testament to power, to artistry, to a way of life that had vanished, leaving behind only these echoing shells. But for you, they were simply a windbreak, a place to lay your head, a muted backdrop to the quiet, insistent thrum of survival. Bread, that never fills. The first act of the day, after shaking off the tenacious grip of sleep and the bone-deep chill, was always the bread. Not the light, airy loaves of pure white flour that the memory of ancient Roman kitchens might still whisper of, but a different kind of bread altogether. This was the bread of endurance, of necessity, a dense, dark mass that felt as heavy as stone in your hand and tasted of the earth from which it came, raw and unyielding. As the grey light grudgingly brightened outside, seeping through the gaps in your makeshift dwelling, you rose from your straw bed and moved towards the hearth. It was less a hearth, more a cleared patch of stone and packed earth in the centre of the hut, where last night's embers still glowed faintly, a single persistent eye of warmth in the surrounding gloom. Kneeling, you gently coaxed the dying coals, blowing on them with measured breaths until a faint orange blush appeared. Small sticks, painstakingly gathered from the tangled weeds and fallen debris outside, were added, then larger pieces of salvaged timber, splintered and worm-eaten, until a tentative flame began to flicker, casting dancing shadows that stretched and shrank across the rough walls. The light was still too dim to see clearly, but your hands knew the way. They found the rough-hewn wooden bowl where the remnants of yesterday's dough lay, covered with a scrap of linen. It was a sourdough, kept alive through generations, its sour tang a familiar, almost comforting scent in the close air. This bread was a continuous cycle, a small piece of the old dough saved each time to leaven the new. You took the heavy, dense dough, punching it down with a practiced motion. It resisted, cold and stiff, a testament to its composition. This was not the fine wheat of the fertile plains brought by well-maintained trade routes. This was grain from fields coaxed from the soil by your own hands, often on land once cultivated by imperial slaves, now abandoned and overgrown. It was a mix of whatever could be grown: tough, hardy barley, a little rye if the harvest was generous, and often tragically bulked out with ground-up husks, dried roots or even weeds, dandelion root, thistle seed, dried nettles, anything to stretch the precious flour. These additions gave the bread its dark colour, its coarse texture, and its deep, earthy, sometimes bitter flavour. Working the dough was a slow, arduous process, a testament to the lack of proper tools. No smooth marble slab here, only a rough-hewn board, scarred and splintered, laid across two stones. Your hands, calloused and chapped from the relentless work, kneaded the stiff mass, folding it, pressing it, trying to develop what little gluten might be present in the inferior flour. The effort warmed your arms, a small comfort against the morning chill, and the rhythmic sound of your palms on the dough became a quiet, meditative counterpoint to the distant sounds of the waking ruins. Once shaped into rough, flat rounds, the loaves were placed near the nascent fire to warm and rise a little, though rise was a generous word for the subtle puffing that would occur. There was no oven, of course, not a proper one. Baking was a more primitive affair. When the fire had built up a good bed of coals, the loaves would be placed directly onto a flat, heated stone, covered with a hot pot or more coals, and left to cook slowly. The result was a bread with a thick, almost burnt crust, and a dense, chewy interior, a solid, uncompromising food that was meant to fill, not to delight. The aroma of baking bread, even this humble, coarse variety, was a small miracle. It mingled with the ever-present wood smoke, creating a scent that spoke of home, of survival, of the stubborn continuation of life in a world that had seemingly forgotten how to be grand. It was a smell that promised sustenance, however meagre. When it was ready, pulled from the coals, its crust still hot and dusted with ash, you broke it. There was no knife, or if there was, it was too precious to use for such a simple task. Your hands tore at the loaf, revealing the dark, uneven crumb within. It was heavy, uncompromising, and would scrape against the roof of your mouth if eaten too quickly. You handed a piece to your husband, his face still creased with sleep and the weariness of constant vigilance. He took it with a grunting acknowledgement, his eyes already scanning the entrance of the hut, listening for any unusual sound. Then to the children, who stirred at the smell, their small hands reaching out, eager and unquestioning. They chewed slowly, deliberately, their jaws working hard at the tough texture. For them this was simply bread, the only kind they had ever known. They had no memory of the finer, lighter fare of a vanished age. This bread was not meant for pleasure. It was fuel. Each bite was a small, determined act of survival. It stilled the hunger, yes, but it rarely truly filled you. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach was a constant companion, quieted for a few hours by the dense calories, but never entirely vanquished. It was enough to give you the strength to face the day's labor, the energy to walk the crumbling roads, to work the stubborn earth. As you ate your own portion, you savored each mouthful, chewing slowly to make it last, to trick your body into feeling more satiated. The taste was bitter, earthy, a little sour, but also nourishing in its own way. It tasted of resilience. It tasted of the broken empire and the new, hard reality. It was the taste of survival itself, hammered into existence from whatever could be found, a daily testament to the stubborn refusal of ordinary people to simply lie down and vanish with the grand monuments that surrounded them. Each crust was a small victory against the encroaching emptiness, a quiet declaration that despite everything, life would find a way to endure. The path to what was once the heart of the city was not a grand paved avenue, but a winding track, worn smooth by generations of bare feet and the passage of laden donkeys. It skirted piles of rubble, flowed around the base of toppled statues, and sometimes disappeared altogether into thickets of thorny scrub that had reclaimed the once manicured spaces. You walked it with an innate sense of direction, guided by the looming shapes of colossal ruins that pierced the bruised morning sky. As you approached, the scale of the place always struck you anew, even though you had walked these same paths countless times. The Forum. The very name was a whisper of a time that felt more legend than history. Once it had been a throbbing artery of the world, a place of shouting merchants, declaiming orators, clanking armor, and the ceaseless murmur of 1,000 voices, 1,000 footsteps. Now it was a vast, open wound in the fabric of the earth, echoing with an almost oppressive silence. The grand, triumphal arches still stood, though their intricate carvings were weathered beyond recognition, their marble faces pitted and grey. They no longer spanned bustling streets, but opened onto empty, overgrown expanses. Grass, tenacious and defiant, pushed through every crack in the immense paving stones, blurring the lines of what had once been ordered thoroughfares. Clumps of thistles and wild herbs grew tall where senators once deliberated, their prickly leaves brushing against the remnants of shattered marble benches. The Forum itself was a landscape of broken giants. Here, a toppled column lay like a bleached bone, its immense segments scattered. There, a headless statue of an emperor, its chiseled toga still majestic, gazed blankly at the sky, its pedestal half swallowed by creeping ivy. The temples, once housing the vibrant cults of forgotten gods, stood as hollowed-out shells, their roofs long since collapsed, their inner sanctuaries open to the sky, now serving as shelter for stray animals or convenient stores for scavenged timber. Today the Forum was a grazing ground. As you picked your way through the debris, the familiar bleating of goats reached you. A small flock, scrawny and agile, picked their way amongst the fallen stones, nibbling at the sparse grass, and the tenacious weeds that grew between the cracks. Their droppings dotted the ancient paving, and their sharp hooves clattered softly on the marble, a sound that seemed terribly small in such a vast, empty space. They were the forum's new inhabitants, their presence a stark metaphor for the diminished ambitions of this age. You weren't here to marvel at the ruins, though their majesty was a constant, unspoken presence. You were here because the sparse, untended grass and weeds offered the promise of forage for your own small, precious flock of chickens, or perhaps a few edible greens for the evening pottage. You carried a crude woven basket, its wicker rough against your palm, and a short, blunt knife, more for prying roots than for cutting. As you bent to pluck a handful of tender shoots from between two massive, broken flagstones, you could almost feel the ghosts of the past around you. The forum was a palimpsest, layers of history pressed one upon the other, each leaving its faint trace. You could imagine the roar of the crowd, the clatter of chariot wheels, the authoritative bark of a centurion. But these were fleeting imaginings, easily dispelled by the sharp bleat of a goat or the rustle of dry weeds in the morning breeze. The reality was the pervasive silence, broken only by the sounds of nature slowly, patiently reclaiming its own. A single, broken archway, its keystone cracked but stubbornly holding, framed a distant view of the city's defensive walls, now crumbling in places, offering more of a suggestion of protection than actual defense. Beyond them, a few smoke plumes rose lazily into the crisp air, marking the clusters of makeshift dwellings that constituted the surviving population. Life clung to the edges, nestled within the folds of decay. The sun, now higher, cast long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the forum floor. It warmed the grey stones, drawing out the ancient scent of sun-baked dust and dry grass. A lizard darted across a patch of warm marble, its quick movements a flash of ancient life in a timeless setting. Overhead, a hawk circled, its cry sharp and solitary, the only sound that seemed to truly fit the scale of the emptiness. You paused, straightening slowly, feeling the familiar ache in your back. Your gaze swept across the panoramic desolation. Once, vast basilicas with gleaming roofs would have lined this space. Temples would have displayed their intricate facades. Statues, burnished and gleaming, would have stood sentinel. Now only their foundations remained, overgrown mounds of earth or solitary fragments that testified to their former glory. The air felt heavy with the weight of that vanished past, a silent elegy. There was a poignant beauty to it, a solemn grandeur in decay. But for you, it was simply the backdrop to your arduous daily existence. The stones offered no comfort, no food, no real shelter beyond a temporary windbreak. They were a reminder of how quickly even the mightiest creations of man could fall, how swiftly order could unravel into chaos. And yet, amidst this vast, silent testimony to impermanence, you persisted. You gathered your handful of greens, the faint scent of earth and wildness clinging to your fingers, a small, tangible harvest from the heart of a fallen empire. The forum was silent, but your life, and the lives of your neighbors, continued to murmur, a quiet, defiant hum against the monumental stillness. The road to nowhere. The path leading out from the main cluster of ruins, where a semblance of life still huddled, was once a testament to Roman ingenuity and dominance, a smooth, straight artery of expertly laid stone designed to endure for centuries, connecting the heart of the empire to its farthest reaches. Now it was a fractured memory, a winding scar through the encroaching wilderness. Your journey today would take you along a stretch of it, to fields that lay further afield, where the soil was still coaxed to yield a meager crop, As you stepped onto the remnants of the ancient highway, the distinct sound of your crude leather sandals on the paving stones was swallowed by the surrounding silence. The surface, once uniformly smooth and even, was now a mosaic of broken tesserae and large, shattered slabs where weeds pushed through with stubborn determination. Deep cracks like ancient wounds spiderwebbed across the surface, some wide enough for a child to trip in, others home to persistent colonies of ants or small scuttling lizards. The edges of the road were no longer neatly defined. Instead, the wild had pushed inwards, blurring the boundary between man's creation and nature's reclamation. Tall grasses, bent and brittle from the morning dew, encroached from either side, rustling with a dry whisper in the faint breeze. Thickets of brambles, thorny and defiant, clawed at the sides, forcing you to walk a narrower, more central path than any legionnaire or merchant would have needed. Here and there, a sapling, slender but resolute, had taken root in a deep fissure, its young branches already reaching for the sky, slowly but surely prying apart the mighty stones. You walked with a steady, measured pace, your gaze sweeping not to admire the engineering, but to scan for hazards. Loose stones, treacherous patches of mud where water had pooled and settled, or simply the presence of something, or someone, unwelcome. The straightness of the Roman road, once a symbol of ordered progress, now felt like a vulnerability, offering little cover from the eyes of a bandit or a scavenging animal. The forests that lined sections of the route, once kept at bay by extensive cultivation, had crept back, their dark, tangled depths feeling watchful and ominous. The silence of the road was profound. Gone were the sounds of carts rumbling, of riders on horseback, of merchants calling out their wares. The only sounds were your own footsteps, the distant call of a crow, and the insistent hum of insects that had made a new home in the crumbling monument. Occasionally, the faint tinkle of a goat bell might carry on the wind from a nearby scattered homestead, but even that was rare. The sheer emptiness of the landscape pressed in on you, a constant reminder of how few people remained, how vast and unpeopled the world had become. Along the way you passed other fragments of the vanished empire. A broken milestone, its Latin inscription eroded by centuries of weather, now served as a convenient perch for a bird. The remains of a small bridge, its arches still largely intact, spanned a narrow, sluggish stream, but its paving was gone, replaced by a precarious scramble of loose rocks and earth. The engineering was magnificent, still stubbornly enduring, but its purpose had withered away. It was a road that no longer led to the bustling markets of Rome, or to the thriving villas of distant provinces. It was a road to nowhere, or at best to a small, isolated cluster of huts clinging to survival. The experience of walking this road was a meditation on loss. Each broken stone, each encroaching weed, each segment of forgotten track spoke of a decline so vast, so pervasive, that it was almost impossible to comprehend. Your ancestors perhaps had walked this same road when it was new, when it was a vibrant artery of a functioning world. They would have travelled with purpose, with goods to trade, with news to share. You walked it with only the grim necessity of survival, carrying a small hoe and a water skin, hoping to return before dusk. The air itself felt different here, away from the immediate shelter of the ruins. Sharper, colder, wilder. The scent of pine needles and damp earth was stronger, mingling with the faint, persistent smell of decay. The clouds overhead moved slowly, heavily, mirroring the ponderous passage of time. The sun, when it broke through, cast fleeting patches of brightness onto the crumbling pavement, highlighting the intricate patterns of moss and lichen that now decorated the ancient stones. Sometimes you might encounter another solitary figure on the road, a fellow peasant perhaps, or a ragged merchant trying to hawk scavenged goods. or a lone pilgrim making their way to some distant shrine. Each encounter was met with a mixture of caution and a flicker of fleeting connection, a brief acknowledgement of shared hardship, a nod, a whispered greeting, a quick exchange of news or rumours. Then each would continue their solitary journey, leaving the vast silence to settle once more. You walked on, the rhythm of your footsteps a slow, steady drum against the monumental stillness. The road was a monument to what was, but also a stark reminder of what was no longer. It was a path through the wilderness, both literal and metaphorical. And yet you walked it because even a crumbling road was still a path, a connection, however tenuous, to the faint pulse of life that stubbornly persisted in the fading light of a forgotten empire. The way ahead was long and the future uncertain, but for today the road was simply a means to an end, a journey that had to be made. A church in the ruins. The grand temples, once glittering with dedications and alive with the smoke of offerings, stood hollowed out and forlorn in the heart of the city's ruins. Their marble pediments were crumbling, their cult statues long since toppled or defaced, their inner sanctums open to the elements. The old gods had departed, or perhaps they had simply faded into the silence, their power dissipated with the empire that had championed them. Yet, in the persistent human need for solace, for ritual, for a guiding hand in a fractured world, new forms of worship had risen, often literally, from the ashes of the old. You made your way towards one such place, a journey that was as much an act of faith as a physical path. It was not a grand basilica built anew, but a practical, tenacious adaptation. The remnants of a substantial Roman villa, perhaps, or a small, sturdy administrative building, had been repurposed. Its walls, still remarkably robust despite the centuries of neglect and depredation, offered the necessary enclosure. The roof, long since collapsed, had been replaced by a rough and ready thatch, shored up with scavenged timber and sealed with mud. It was humble, crude, but it stood. As you approached, the first sign of its purpose was the cross, not a gleaming, sculpted work of art, but a simple, unadorned cross of rough-hewn wood, lashed together and planted firmly into the ground before the entrance. The entrance itself was a gaping archway, once a grand portico, now curtained with heavy, smoke-stained hides against the wind and the prying eyes of the outside world. Pushing aside the heavy hide, you stepped inside. The air was thick, still and heavy, with the pervasive smell of old incense, damp stone, and the human presence of countless murmured prayers. The interior was cavernous and dim, relying almost entirely on the flickering light of tallow candles and the faint, bruised light that filtered through small, unglazed openings high in the walls. These small windows, barely more than slits, were patched with animal bladders or thin, scraped horn, offering little clarity but preventing the ingress of the worst of the weather. The space within was a stark contrast to the opulence of the pagan temples. Here there were no intricate mosaics on the floor, no elaborate frescoes on the walls. The floor was simply tamped earth, scattered with rushes that rustled faintly underfoot. The walls, though Roman in origin, were now bare, whitewashed with lime, perhaps, or simply left in their raw, aged state, bearing the faint, ghostly impressions of long-vanished murals. The only decoration was a crude wooden crucifix, carved by a local hand, standing on a simple stone altar. Yet despite its austerity, the place held a profound sense of sanctity. The very act of gathering here, in this improvised space, was an affirmation of hope in a hopeless age. A small group of people were already present, kneeling on the earth, their heads bowed. Old women, their faces etched with the deep lines of hardship, their hands gnarled by endless labor. A young mother, a sleeping infant, clutched to her chest. A few men, their expressions grim, their eyes weary, but a flicker of something resembling peace in their depths. The priest was not a grand bishop in rich vestments, but a man from among the people, his rough tunic no finer than your own. His voice, when he began to speak, was low and resonant, echoing slightly in the vastness of the space. He spoke in Latin, but not the refined classical Latin of Cicero. This was a coarser, more vernacular tongue, interspersed with local dialects understood by those who gathered. His words were of reassurance, of divine mercy, of the promise of a better life beyond this earthly struggle. The murmur of prayers that rose from the small congregation was a balm in the quiet. It was a collective sigh of longing, of yearning for order and grace in a world that offered so little of either. The scent of a burning tallow candle, thin and smoky, mingled with the earthy smell of the hut and the faint, sweet scent of lingering incense from a more recent service. Each small flame cast long dancing shadows that stretched across the rough walls, making the bare stones seem to shift and breathe. This was where people brought their fears, the fear of hunger, of sickness, of bandits, of the warlord's next demand. This was where they brought their quiet hopes, for a good harvest, for healthy children, for the strength to endure another winter. Here, amidst the crumbling grandeur of a vanished empire, the new faith offered a different kind of edifice, one built not of marble and gold, but of shared belief and community. As you knelt, your knees aching on the cold earth, you felt a peculiar sense of continuity. The gods of Rome were gone, but the human need to seek meaning, to find comfort in something larger than oneself, remained. The ruins outside were a testament to the impermanence of earthly power, but the enduring act of prayer, whispered in this makeshift sanctuary, spoke of something more resilient. It was a quiet, profound act of defiance against the chaos, a small, flickering light of hope in a world shrouded in the deep shadows of decline. The chants were simple, the hymns sometimes off-key, but the conviction was as strong and unyielding as the ancient stones that formed the very walls of this humble, sacred space. Work and want, fields by the broken villa. The fields were not the orderly, expansive tracts of land depicted in some faded memory of Roman agricultural texts. These were patches carved out with grim determination from land that had once been meticulously managed, now left to succumb to the wild. Your journey from the ruins of the city had brought you here to the shadow of a truly broken villa, its remaining walls standing like hollow teeth against the sky. Its grandeur was long gone, plundered for building materials, its mosaic floors ripped up, its baths filled with rubble and weeds. Yet, around its desolate shell, life persisted, stubbornly clinging to the earth. The land here was a testament to the slow, relentless erosion of order. Once, this would have been a well-irrigated, expertly tilled estate, producing bountiful harvests of wheat, olives, and grapes. Now the old irrigation channels were choked with silt and overgrown with reeds. The terraces had collapsed in places, creating uneven, difficult ground. The rich, dark soil, left untended for decades, had hardened into a stubborn, unforgiving surface, or had been leached of its nutrients by ceaseless rain and wind. You carried your crude tools, a simple wooden plough tipped with a scavenged piece of iron, pulled by a scrawny ox that barely had the strength for the task, a heavy, short-handled hoe, its blade dull from constant use, and a sharp, flint-tipped sickle for cutting grain. These were the implements of survival, forged from necessity rather than craft. The work began with the breaking of the earth. The plough struggled, groaning through the tough sod, turning over shallow furrows that were more ragged tears in the soil than neat lines. The ox, bony and slow, strained against its yoke, its breath pluming in the crisp air. You walked behind, your hands gripping the plough handles, your shoulders aching with the effort, guiding the blade with practiced movements, your eyes fixed on the grudgingly upturned soil. Each clod of earth that surrendered its grip to the plough was a small victory. The ground was a mosaic of what it once was and what it had become. Here, a fragment of Roman roof tile would surface, red against the brown earth. There, a piece of broken pottery, its painted pattern almost entirely faded. Sometimes a more unsettling find, a coin, green with verdigris, bearing the face of an emperor, long forgotten, a silent testament to wealth and power that had simply dissolved. Or, more grimly, a bone, bleached white and smooth, whose origin was best left unquestioned. The sowing was a ritual of hope against experience. With a careful, almost reverent hand, you scattered the precious seed, mostly barley or hardy rye, sometimes a few sparse beans or lentils, into the freshly turned earth. Each seed was a prayer, a desperate gamble against the unpredictable forces of nature, against the rapacious demands of the local warlord, against the constant threat of vermin. The seeds were often poor quality, saved from the previous year's meagre harvest, some withered, some half-eaten. But they were all you had. The sun beat down as the day progressed, warming the air, drawing a faint, earthy smell from the soil. Sweat beaded on your brow, stinging your eyes, but you pressed on. There was no rest until the designated patch was sown. The shadows of the broken villa lengthened behind you, its skeletal walls seeming to watch your slow, arduous labor with a mute, unchanging indifference. It had seen empires rise and fall, great estates flourish and wither. Your struggle was but a tiny flicker in its vast, silent memory. The fields stretched out, a patchwork of varying cultivation. Some areas were dense with tangled weeds too stubborn to reclaim. Others were fallow, left to rest and recover some semblance of fertility, though often they simply lay barren, awaiting a hand and a strength that might never come. Your own plot was small, carefully tended but always precarious. A few bad weeks of weather, a blight, a raid, and the struggle became impossible. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant wildflowers and the faint, acrid tang of wood smoke from other scattered homesteads. The sounds of the wild were never far, the chirping of crickets in the tall grass, the buzzing of bees around a patch of blooming weeds, the occasional distant cry of a bird of prey. These were the new sounds of the land, replacing the ordered rhythms of a Roman farm. As the day waned, the last of the seed was scattered, the last furrow drawn. You paused, leaning on your hoe, surveying the small, brown rectangle of earth that was your family's fragile lifeline. It was an insignificant patch in the grand scheme of the vast, overgrown landscape, but for you, it was everything. It represented the promise of bread, of survival, of another year. The sun dipped lower, painting the broken walls of the villa in hues of orange and purple, making its decay seem almost beautiful. You led the weary ox back towards your makeshift shelter, the weight of the day's labor heavy in your limbs, but with a faint, deep-seated sense of accomplishment. Grain coaxed from the earth, it was a daily act of defiance, a quiet victory in a world that offered few triumphs. The estates lay shattered, but life, tenacious and unyielding, rooted itself anew. The blacksmith's fire. In a world where the grand infrastructure of Rome had crumbled where new goods rarely arrived, and old ones were constantly consumed by use and decay, the village blacksmith was more than a craftsman. He was an alchemist of survival. His forge was not a place of industrial production, but a sanctuary of endurance, a place where broken things were given new purpose, and precious iron, once merely a common commodity, was treasured like gold. The blacksmith shop was not an elegant structure. It was often a simple, sturdy shed, built from salvaged timbers and rough-hewn stone, leaning against the remains of a more substantial Roman wall that offered a measure of shelter. Its roof was thick with thatch, stained black by generations of smoke, and its floor was packed earth, hardened by countless hammer blows and impregnated with charcoal dust and metal filings. You made your way to his forge, carrying a broken tool, perhaps a cracked hoe blade or a bent piece of a ploughshare. Such an item was not easily replaced. It represented a significant portion of your family's productive capacity, a link in the chain of survival. The journey was always a little anxious, for the smith's skills were in high demand, and his prices in kind or labor were steep. As you approached, the first sign of his presence was the rhythmic, ringing clang of hammer on anvil, a sound that cut through the pervasive quiet of the ruins. It was a sound of purpose, of creation, of enduring human industry. The smell of coal smoke and hot metal was strong in the air, a pungent, acrid aroma that spoke of heat and transformation. Pushing aside a heavy leather curtain that served as a door, you stepped into the dim, smoky interior. The air was thick with the grey haze of charcoal smoke, illuminated by the pulsating infernal glow of the forge. The heat, even away from the immediate vicinity of the fire, was a welcome embrace after the morning chill, a stark contrast to the cold indifference of the ruins outside. The smith was a figure of immense strength, his muscles honed by years of wielding a heavy hammer. His face was perpetually grimy with soot, his hands calloused and scarred, his eyes sharp and focused, reflecting the flickering light of the coals. He wore a heavy leather apron, scarred and singed, offering some protection from the sparks that danced like malevolent fireflies in the dimness. His tools were few, but essential. A massive anvil, its surface worn smooth by generations of strikes, a heavy sledgehammer, and lighter hand hammers, tongs of various sizes, and a trough of water for quenching the hot metal, which hissed and spat dramatically, sending clouds of steam into the air. The bellows, a large leather bag operated by a foot pedal, sucked in air with a guttural gasp and pushed it into the heart of the coals, making them roar with renewed intensity. The broken tool you carried was scrutinized with a professional eye. The smith turned it over, feeling the fracture, assessing the quality of the ancient iron. "Aye," he'd grunt, "it can be saved, but it will take time and a good piece of your barley." A negotiation would ensue, always in kind, for coins were increasingly meaningless. Eggs, a measure of grain, a promise of labor during harvest. These were the currencies of this new age. Watching him work was a mesmerizing dance of power and precision. He thrust a piece of dull, cold iron into the heart of the roaring forge, feeding the fire with a rhythmic pump of the bellows. As the metal heated, it slowly transformed from dull grey to cherry red, then to a brilliant, incandescent orange, shimmering with heat. With a practiced sweep of his tongs, he plucked it from the coals and laid it on the anvil. Then came the hammer. The sound was deafening, a cascade of ringing blows that echoed through the small space, vibrating through the very earth. Each strike was deliberate, powerful, shaping the stubborn metal, drawing out its impurities, melding the broken pieces back into a semblance of wholeness. Sparks flew in dazzling arcs, brief, bright stars against the smoky dark. The air filled with the scent of hot iron, a primal, ancient smell. Sometimes he would be repairing a hinge or sharpening an axe. Other times he would be working on something more significant, a broken sword, its blade snapped in some forgotten skirmish, now being reforged into a useful tool. Iron was precious now, salvaged from forgotten battlefields, from abandoned villas, from the very ruins themselves. Every scrap was worth its weight in the most valuable currency, survival. You waited patiently, watching, listening to the symphony of his craft. The blacksmith was a linchpin of the community, one of the few who could mend what was broken, who could ensure that the tools of sustenance continued to function. Without him, the already precarious existence of your village would be even more fragile. Finally, after much hammering and heating and quenching, the tool was ready. It was not pristine, its reforged parts bore the scars of its mending, but it was whole again, strong, and ready for another season of labor. You took it, feeling the weight, the slight warmth that still lingered in the metal, a deep sense of relief washing over you. This was not a luxury, it was life itself, hammered back into shape. As you stepped back out into the cool grey light of the ruins, carrying your mended tool, the ringing clang of the blacksmith's fire faded behind you, a powerful, persistent sound in a world where so much else had fallen silent. Herding among stones. The animals were not just beasts of burden or sources of food, they were companions in survival, their warmth, their milk, their hides, and their labor woven inextricably into the fabric of daily life. Today your task was to take the small flock of goats and the 2 scrawny cows out to graze. But this was no verdant pasture, this was a landscape defined by the remnants of empire, a place where cattle now wandered where senators once strolled. The air was still cool as you led the animals out from their rough enclosure, built from salvaged stones and interwoven branches, within the shelter of a collapsed Roman market hall. Their breath plumed white in the crisp morning air, and their hooves, hard and nimble, clattered softly on the broken flagstones. The goats, with their twitching ears and restless intelligence, bounded ahead, eager for the sparse forage. The cows, older and more ponderous, followed with a slow, deliberate gait. Your destination was the Forum, that vast, silent heart of the old city. It was a contradictory choice, a place of immense historical weight now reduced to a patchy grazing ground. But the grass there, though sparse and mixed with weeds, was untroubled by human cultivation and offered sustenance. As you guided the small herd, you navigated a path that wound through fallen masonry. A goat would nimbly leap over a toppled Corinthian capital, its intricate carvings now a mere obstacle. A cow would carefully step around a shattered marble frieze, its polished surface worn smooth by centuries of rain and neglect. The animals moved with an instinctive grace through the ruins, as if they had always belonged here, as if the Forum had always been intended as their pasture. The sun climbed higher, casting long, stark shadows from the standing columns and broken arches. The light illuminated the intricate patterns of moss and lichen that clung to the ancient stones, turning them into tapestries of green and grey. The air filled with the buzzing of insects, drawn to the flowering weeds that thrived in the neglected spaces. The only other sounds were the occasional bleating of a goat, the soft lowing of a cow, and the constant, gentle rustle of the wind through the tall, dry grasses. You walked with a long, sturdy staff, more for guiding the animals and pushing aside thorny bushes than for defense. Your eyes, however, were constantly scanning for edible plants the animals might miss, for potential dangers, for signs of others. In this fragmented world, a lone herder with livestock was always a target. The animals spread out, each finding its own patch of sparse grass to chew on, their jaws moving with a slow, rhythmic grind. The goats, ever curious, would sometimes climb onto a low pile of broken statuary, their slender legs surprisingly steady on the uneven surfaces, reaching for a particularly succulent shoot of ivy or a cluster of wild berries. You kept a watchful eye on them, lest they wander too far into the treacherous depths of the ruins. The broken statues that dotted the landscape were not artistic wonders to you, they were merely part of the terrain. a headless figure in a flowing toga made for a convenient back-scratcher for a cow. A majestic bust, half buried in the earth, became a small, temporary obstacle for a curious goat. Their expressions, once so full of Roman pride and imperial authority, now seemed to mock the current reality with their silent, unchanging gaze. The sky was vast and indifferent above the ruins, a canvas for the slow drift of clouds. The silence of the forum was profound, broken only by the sounds of the animals and the occasional cry of a bird. It was a silence that spoke volumes about the shift in power, about the diminished status of humanity. Once this space had resonated with the voices of thousands, shaping laws and destinies. Now it resonated with the soft, earthy sounds of a few grazing animals. You found a relatively smooth, flat stone, perhaps a fallen piece of an old pavement, and sat watching the herd. Your thoughts were not of philosophy or history, but of the more immediate future. Would the grass be enough? Would the cows give enough milk? Would the new calf survive the winter? These were the questions that occupied the mind of a herder in a fallen world. As the sun reached its zenith, casting minimal shadows, the animals settled into a slower rhythm, their initial hunger sated. You ate a piece of your coarse bread, washed down with water from a leather skin, your gaze sweeping the periphery. The ruins around you were a constant reminder of fragility and change, but the steady, enduring life of the animals, their simple demands, offered a different kind of solace. They were a link to the practical, essential rhythms of existence, a quiet affirmation that despite the collapse of an empire, life, in its most fundamental forms, continued. And you, the humble herder, were a part of that enduring pulse, guiding your small flock through the majestic, silent graveyard of a once great civilization. The weaver's hands. In a world where trade routes had fractured, where new garments were a rare and expensive luxury, and the grand workshops of the empire had fallen silent, the skill of the weaver was paramount. Clothes were not simply coverings, they were shields against the cold, against the thorns of the wild, against the gaze of the elements. Each thread was a testament to survival, each patch a story of endurance. You sat by the flickering light of the hearth, the rough wooden frame of the loom creaking softly with each movement of your hands. It was a simple, upright loom, fashioned from scavenged timber and branches, its warp threads stretched taut, waiting for the intricate dance of the shuttle. The air in the hut was thick, with the faint scent of lanolin, damp earth, and wood smoke, a familiar, comforting blend. The wool you worked with was not the fine, soft merino of imperial robes. It was coarse, scratchy wool, shorn from the backs of your own few sheep, or traded for with a neighbouring farmer. It still carried the strong, earthy smell of the animal, even after being washed in the cold river water and painstakingly picked clean of burrs and dirt. Each fibre was precious, carefully handled, for there was no surplus, no waste. The process began long before the loom. First, the raw wool had to be carded, painstakingly pulled apart and disentangled with a pair of crude wooden combs, teeth made from sharpened thorns or carefully whittled bone. This separated the fibres, aligning them into soft, fluffy rolls. And then came the spinning. You held a distaff under your arm, a stick holding a bundle of prepared wool, and with the other hand worked the spindle, a weighted stick that spun the fibres into a continuous thread. It was a slow, repetitive motion, practiced for years, until the thread emerged, uneven in places but strong enough to hold. Your fingers, gnarled and calloused from years of such work, moved with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The soft whir of the spindle, the gentle click of the loom, the rustle of the wool. These were the sounds of quiet industry, of a domesticity that stubbornly defied the surrounding chaos. The loom itself was a hub of creation, the place where disparate fibers became a coherent whole, where the raw materials of survival were transformed into the necessities of life. Today you were mending, as you often were. Not creating new cloth, for that was a task reserved for moments of greater plenty or for the bare essentials. More often, it was patching. The tunics, the cloaks, the blankets, they were worn thin, threadbare in places, torn by daily labor or the persistent gnawing of vermin. Each garment was a living history of its use, a patchwork quilt of different shades of homespun wool, each patch telling of a previous tear, a previous repair. You threaded a thick iron needle with a piece of hand-spun yarn, the eye of the needle large enough for the coarse thread. Then, with deliberate, even stitches, you began to mend a tear in your husband's cloak, a tear made by a thorny branch while gathering firewood. Your fingers worked deftly, weaving the new threads into the old, drawing the edges of the fabric together, making it strong once more. The new patch would stand out, a slightly different color or texture, but that was of no concern. Function trumped aesthetics. The light from the hearth was dim, casting long, dancing shadows that made the rough walls of the hut seem to undulate. Outside, the world was receding into the early afternoon gloom, the broken arches of the city's ruins fading into indistinct masses. But inside, by the fire, in the rhythmic motion of your hands, there was a sense of purpose, a small, contained world of order and creation. Sometimes, as you worked, you would hum a low, ancient tune, a song passed down through generations, its words speaking of harvests and hearths, of the quiet joys and sorrows of a peasant's life. Or, if the children were awake, you might tell a simple story, its narrative unfolding with the steady rhythm of the loom, weaving tales of heroes and spirits into the smoky air. The clothes you wore, the clothes you made, were not soft against the skin. They were rough, heavy, designed for warmth and durability, not comfort, but they were essential. Without them, the biting winter winds, the persistent dampness, the endless exposure to the elements would be unbearable. Each repaired garment was a small victory against the encroaching cold, a testament to the perseverance of human ingenuity in the face of scarcity. As the sun began its final descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple that briefly illuminated the smoke hole in the roof, you tied off the last stitch. The tear was mended, the cloak whole again, ready to face another day, another season. You held it up, feeling its rough weight, its familiar scent. It was not a luxury, but a necessity, a product of weary hands and a tenacious spirit. And in its humble wholeness there was a quiet, deep satisfaction, a small victory against the relentless unraveling of the world. The mill beside the river. The river was a constant. While roads crumbled and villas decayed, the river flowed, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, a steady pulse of life through the heart of the landscape. And along its banks a crucial piece of ancient ingenuity stubbornly persisted. The mill. It was not the industrial marvels of later ages, but a simple water wheel, its timber weathered and worn, groaning with each revolution, a powerful, rhythmic beat against the quietude of the land. You had risen before dawn, carrying 2 sacks of grain on your shoulder, the weight pressing down on your already aching bones. The grain was precious, carefully winnowed from your last meagre harvest, and the journey to the mill was a necessary pilgrimage. The path followed the winding course of the river, muddy and uneven, forcing you to step carefully, lest you slip and lose your vital cargo. As you drew near, the deep, rhythmic creak and splash of the water wheel became audible, a sound that carried across the water, growing steadily louder. It was a powerful, almost primal sound, a symphony of wood and water, a testament to enduring function amidst widespread disuse. It was the sound of sustenance. The mill itself was a sturdy, squat structure built largely of rough-hewn stone and thick timber beams. It had likely stood for centuries, perhaps even predating the full collapse of Rome, passed down through generations, its design simple but effective. Its roof was heavy thatch, thick and dark with age, its walls streaked with moss and dampness from its proximity to the water. A thin plume of smoke curled lazily from a crude chimney, indicating the presence of the miller, a figure as essential to the community as the blacksmith. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, you stepped into the dim, cool interior. The air was thick with the sweet, pervasive smell of flour dust, mingled with the damp earth and the deeper, almost metallic scent of the river itself. The main chamber was dominated by the immense, rumbling machinery, the heavy grindstones turning slowly, relentlessly, one atop the other, powered by the unseen water wheel outside. The sound was deafening, a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the very floor beneath your feet. The miller, a burly figure with flour dust clinging to his hair and clothes like a permanent cloak, greeted you with a nod. His face, usually grim, held a flicker of recognition. He would remember your family, your last harvest, the quality of your grain. There was no impersonal transaction here, no receipt. It was a matter of trust, of reputation, of community. You heaved your sacks onto a waiting bench, feeling the immediate relief in your shoulders. The grain would be poured into the hopper, a wooden funnel above the grindstones, which would slowly feed it between the turning stones. The stones, ancient and worn, ground the grain with a slow, powerful action, reducing the tough kernels to a coarse, uneven flour. This was not the fine, sifted flour of a wealthier age. It was whole grain, often containing husks and bits of chaff, lending it a dark, rustic appearance. Sifting, if it happened at all, was a laborious process done by hand at home, using rough sieves of woven hair or coarse cloth. Here, the priority was simply to transform the hard kernels into something digestible. While your grain was being milled, you might wait, perhaps by the small, smoky hearth in the corner where the miller kept a perpetual fire burning. Other villagers might arrive, carrying their own precious sacks, exchanging quiet greetings and snippets of news. Rumors of distant raids, reports of the harvest, news of births or deaths. These were the currencies of conversation, whispered over the constant rumble of the millstones. The mill, though a place of vital function, was also a place of anxiety. The miller took his due, a portion of the milled flour, a miller's toll, a necessary payment for his labour, and the maintenance of the invaluable machinery. It was a part of your harvest that you would never see, a necessary cost of survival. You watched as your grain disappeared into the hopper, a small knot of worry tightening in your stomach. Would there be enough left? Would the milling be efficient? The rhythmic creak of the water wheel outside, the deep rumble of the stones, the subtle vibrations through the floor. These were the enduring sounds of a world stripped bare, but still turning. The river flowed on, providing the power, a silent, ceaseless engine of survival. Without this mill, without the persistent ingenuity of those who kept it running, life would be infinitely harder, perhaps impossible for many. Finally, the miller would signal your flour, now transformed, would be poured into your empty sacks. It was warm, still dusty, and smelled powerfully of raw grain. You heaved the heavier sacks back onto your shoulders, the weight now familiar, but with the added satisfaction of a task completed, a crucial step in the long, arduous process of feeding your family. Stepping back out into the bright daylight, the silence seemed profound after the roar of the mill. You walked the muddy path back home, the weight of the flour a comforting presence on your back, a tangible promise of future bread. The water wheel creaked behind you, a distant, steadfast sound grinding on just as the people endured, coaxing sustenance from the land, one precious grain at a time. Lords, strangers, and fear, the warlord's demand. The sun had barely warmed the chill from the morning air when the unwelcome news arrived, carried by the ragged panting of a boy from a neighbouring settlement. The warlord's men were coming. The words hung in the air, heavy and dread-filled, casting a shadow over the precarious peace of your village. It was a familiar dread, a cyclical fear that tightened the gut and left a bitter taste in the mouth. Rome had once brought laws, however harsh, and a semblance of order. Its legions, for all their brutality, had offered a form of protection. Now there were no laws beyond the arbitrary will of whoever possessed the strongest sword and the largest band of armed men. The world was fragmented, ruled by a shifting tapestry of minor chieftains, ambitious strongmen, and brigand leaders, each carving out a domain of tribute and fear. Your small cluster of huts, nestled among the greater ruins, fell under the uncertain sway of one such figure. His name was whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The Bear, or Iron Hand, or some other epithet that spoke of brute force and unwavering resolve. He was not a ruler of legitimacy, not a man who held the imperial purple, but a man who held power through the only currency that mattered now, steel and hunger. The demand was always the same, though its precise weight varied with the seasons and the warlord's immediate needs. Grain, cattle, young men for his retinue, women for his camp. Today it was grain and cattle, a heavy portion of your harvest, a precious cow or two, to be delivered to his camp some day's journey away, or to his appointed collection point, often a fortified ruin that served as his temporary stronghold. Panic, quiet and internal, spread through the small community. Children were shushed, pulled close, faces that were already grim hardened further. You could feel the unspoken tension, the collective fear that pulsed through the air, like a slow, heavy drum. To refuse was unthinkable. It meant death, the burning of your huts, the slaughter of your livestock, the enslavement of your family. To comply was to give up what little you had, to face the lean season with even less. You watched your husband, his brow furrowed, his eyes distant, already calculating. How much could truly be spared? How much could be hidden? The grain had been painstakingly cultivated, harvested, and stored, each sack a testament to endless toil and constant vigilance. The cattle were your wealth, your source of milk and meat, of hide and muscle. To surrender them felt like tearing a piece of your own flesh. The warlord's men, when they arrived, were a stark contrast to the quiet, stoic inhabitants of your village. They rode on rough horses, their movements radiating a restless energy, a crude power. Their weapons were not the finely crafted implements of a Roman legion, but a motley collection of salvaged swords, rough-hewn axes and spears, some tipped with scavenged iron, others with fire-hardened wood. Their clothes were patched and stained, but often adorned with some crude token of their warlord, a symbol of their belonging to a greater, fearsome force. Their voices were loud, their laughter harsh, their presence filling the quiet spaces of your village with an unsettling tension. They spoke in a rough tongue, a mixture of the old Latin and new guttural Germanic words, their commands delivered with an air of absolute authority. They were not here to negotiate, they were here to collect. You watched from the shadows of your hut, holding your youngest child close, its small hand gripping your tunic. The men moved through the village, their eyes cold and assessing, examining the small stores of grain, the meagre livestock. the faces of the villagers. There was no respect in their gaze, only the calculation of what could be taken, what could be extorted. Your husband, along with the other village elders, stood before the warlord's captain, a burly, scarred man with a cold gleam in his eye. The captain's demands were barked out, precise and unyielding. The villagers tried to appeal, to explain the poor harvest, the struggles of the past year, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. There was no mercy here, no understanding, only the iron logic of power. The grain sacks were brought out, heavy and reluctantly. The cattle were led from their pens, their soft lowing a mournful sound in the cold air. Each offering was a sacrifice, a piece of your future being handed over to secure your present, however precarious. The men moved with brutal efficiency, loading the grain onto their horses, driving the cattle away with sharp shouts and the cracking of whips. As they finally departed, their figures receding down the crumbling Roman road, a heavy silence fell over the village. It was a silence filled with exhaustion, with resentment, with a bitter sense of injustice, but also with a deep, primal relief. They had gone. For now you were safe. For now you could breathe. The remnants of what was taken hung heavy in the air, a visible void in your storehouses, a palpable emptiness in your pastures. The future stretched out, leaner than before, the shadow of hunger now a little closer. The warlord's demand was not merely a tax, it was a constant, terrifying reminder of your vulnerability, of the fragile thread by which your lives now hung suspended between the forgotten grandeur of Rome and the brutal realities of a fragmented world. It was a chilling testament to the new order where might, not law, made right. The priest's visit. If the warlord represented the brute force of the fragmented world, the priest represented a different kind of authority, one that sought to bind communities not through fear of the sword, but through the enduring power of faith. His visits were less frequent than the demands of secular power, but equally significant, puncturing the quiet isolation of your village with their promise of spiritual solace and their stark reminders of eternal consequence. The priest was not from your immediate village. Such a luxury was rare. He was an itinerant figure, perhaps attached to a distant monastery, or serving a scattering of rural communities from a more substantial church in a larger ruined city. He would arrive on foot, or perhaps on a sturdy but plain donkey, his simple robes dusty from the journey, a worn satchel slung over his shoulder, carrying his sacred texts and meagre belongings. His presence, though humble, carried an air of gravity, an aura of otherworldliness that set him apart. News of his impending arrival would precede him, carried by the same whisper network that spread rumors of bandits or warlords. A faint ripple of anticipation and apprehension would pass through the community. Children would be admonished to behave, clothes would be dusted off, and any small offerings, a few eggs, a measure of milk, a cleaned piece of leather, would be prepared. When he finally appeared, a solitary figure against the backdrop of crumbling arches and overgrown fields, a quiet reverence would settle over the village. He was greeted with humble bows and murmured blessings. His face, often gaunt from travel and fasting, held a quiet wisdom. His eyes, though weary, possessing a piercing clarity. He would be offered the best corner of a hut, or perhaps the small, cleaner space in the makeshift church if one existed. A fire would be kept burning, and the best of the coarse bread and thin pottage would be offered, though often he would refuse anything but the barest sustenance, mindful of the scarcity that gripped your lives. His visit was a time for communal prayer, for blessings and for confession. The gathering would take place in the largest hut, or in the adapted church, or simply outdoors if the weather permitted, under the indifferent gaze of the silent ruins. The air, usually filled with the mundane sounds of daily life, would become quiet, broken only by the murmur of his voice, speaking in a solemn, albeit sometimes rough, Latin. He spoke of God's omnipresence, of sin and redemption, of the fleeting nature of earthly suffering compared to the eternal promise of the afterlife. His words were a blend of comfort and warning. Comfort, because they offered hope in a world that felt increasingly hopeless, a sense of divine order amidst the chaos. Warning, because they reminded everyone of the ever-present threat of eternal damnation for straying from the path. As he led the prayers, his voice rising and falling in ancient cadences, you would close your eyes, the smoky air of the hut feeling strangely sacred. You could hear the rustle of straw, the shuffling of bare feet, the occasional cough from a child, but mostly you heard the collective sigh of the community, seeking meaning, seeking forgiveness, seeking strength. Confession was a quiet, private affair, held often in hushed tones by the dying light of a candle or a lingering ember. People would cue, their faces etched with anxiety, waiting to unburden their souls. The priest would listen patiently, his answers sometimes cryptic, sometimes stern, but always ending with a prayer, a penance, and the solemn blessing of absolution. For people living a hand-to-mouth existence, every transgression, every moment of despair felt amplified. The opportunity to confess, to wipe the slate clean, offered a profound spiritual relief. Beyond the spiritual, the priest often brought news from other settlements, a vital lifeline in an isolated world. He might carry a tattered scroll from a distant monastery or share a story he had heard on his travels. These snippets of information, however fragmented, helped to stitch together a mental map of the larger broken world outside your immediate environs. He might also offer practical advice drawn from his travels and his studies: how to treat a certain ailment, a better way to store grain against vermin, a cautionary tale about a particularly dangerous bandit group. His knowledge, though not of this world, often had profound practical implications for survival within it. His presence, though brief, left a lasting impression. He was a beacon of the old world's enduring values, a reminder of a grander structure of belief that transcended the squalor and desperation of daily life. He represented continuity, hope, and a moral compass in a landscape where all other compasses seemed to have spun wildly out of true. As he prepared to depart, usually at dawn the following day, the villagers would gather to bid him farewell, pressing small, humble offerings into his hands. He would offer a final blessing, a gesture of peace and protection, before setting off once more down the crumbling Roman road, a solitary figure walking into the uncertain distance. And as he faded from view, a quiet reverence remained, a renewed sense of purpose, a faint echo of hope in the smoky air of your humble hut. His words, his blessings, his warnings would linger, a vital thread in the fabric of your enduring faith. Neighbors at the threshold. In a fragmented world where the vast, impersonal mechanisms of empire had vanished, life contracted to the intensely personal, the immediate, the local. And within that constricted sphere, neighbors were everything. They were your allies, your rivals, your companions in an uncertain existence. Their presence at your threshold, a dark silhouette against the waning light, was rarely a casual event. It often carried with it the weight of news, the warmth of shared gossip, or the chilling whisper of quiet fears. The threshold of your hut was not a grand doorway, but a simple, low opening, usually covered by a hide or a rough wooden board. It was a clear boundary between the inner sanctuary of your family and the unpredictable world outside. When a neighbor appeared there, their face framed by the darkness, it was an invitation, a request for shared time and space. Perhaps it was Ilara, her hands gnarled from working the unforgiving soil, her eyes, though weary, always quick to observe. She lived in a hut barely a stone's throw from your own, built into the side of a collapsed Roman market wall. She knew the land, its temperaments, its hidden bounty. Or perhaps it was old Thomas, his back bent, his memory a trove of stories from a time before the deepest decline, when the ruins had seemed less ruinous. The visit might be simple, to borrow a handful of salt, a rare and precious commodity, or to trade a few eggs for a measure of your husband's rough-hewn timber. But even these mundane exchanges were fraught with a deeper significance. They were acts of mutual dependence, small threads strengthening the fragile web of community. As they stepped inside, shaking the damp earth from their feet, they would bring with them the lingering scent of their own hearth smoke, their own distinct blend of earth and human presence. The small, low room of your hut would feel momentarily crowded, filled not just with their physical presence, but with the subtle current of their day, their worries, their small triumphs. The exchange would begin with a long, comfortable silence, perhaps, a shared warmth by the hearth, the quiet crackle of the fire filling the space. Then, slowly, the words would begin, soft and low, almost whispered, as if the very air outside, vast and empty, might carry them away. "The wolves were closer last night," Elara might say, her voice tight, with a fear you understood all too well. "Heard them near the old aqueduct. Best to keep the sheep close." A shared nod, a shiver of unease. The constant primal threat of the wild was never far. Or Thomas might lean in, his voice raspy. "Heard from a peddler passing through the north road." The warlord, he moves his camp again. "Closer to the riverlands, they say." This news, always unsettling, would be met with grim faces. A shifting warlord meant new demands, new dangers, a fresh wave of anxiety. It was information that could mean the difference between life and death, between a meager harvest surviving or being plundered. Gossip, too, was a vital part of these exchanges. Who was ill? Whose child was born strong? Who had been seen venturing too far beyond the familiar paths? These were not idle tales, they were intelligence, building a picture of the health and resilience of the community, highlighting potential vulnerabilities or unexpected strengths. Every bit of knowledge was a tool for survival. As the conversation flowed, the fire would glow, casting dancing shadows on the rough walls, making the faces of your neighbors seem both familiar and slightly spectral in the dim light. The sense of shared hardship was profound. No one here lived in isolation. Your fates were intertwined, woven together by the threads of shared land, shared resources, and shared dangers. You might offer a small cup of weak ale or a piece of the coarse bread, a gesture of hospitality that was also a gesture of recognition, of belonging. These were not luxuries, but small, vital rituals that reinforced the bonds between you. The children, if they were awake, would listen, their small faces rapt, absorbing the murmur of adult voices, the undercurrent of concern and resilience. They were learning the rhythms of this new, hard world, the vital importance of listening, of understanding the subtle signals that passed between their elders. As the hour grew late, the sky outside turning an inky black, punctuated by the vast, indifferent stars that shone down on the silent ruins, your neighbors would finally rise to leave. The farewells would be brief, simple. "Stay safe then," or "Good fortune in the morning." But the words carried a profound weight, a deep sense of care and shared vulnerability. You would watch them go, their forms receding into the darkness, until only the faint sound of their footsteps faded into the pervasive quiet. And as you barred your own door, wedging the heavy plank into place, you would reflect on the information gathered, the fears acknowledged, the small, vital connections reaffirmed. In a world that offered so little certainty, the quiet strength and enduring ties of neighbors at the threshold were a lifeline, a flickering light against the encroaching darkness. Lords, strangers, and fear. The tribute paid. The memory of Rome was a distant whisper, a ghost in the vast, empty halls of its former power. In its stead, a new, brutal reality had settled upon the land. The mechanisms of taxation and trade had dissolved, replaced by a simpler, more savage system. Tribute. When the warlords' men came, as they inevitably did, their demands were clear, and the currency was no longer the finely minted silver of imperial Rome, but the raw, unadorned bounty of the earth and the sweat of your brow. The collection point was often a grim, utilitarian space. Sometimes it was a fortified barn, crudely repaired from the stones of an old Roman bathhouse. Other times it was simply an open field ringed by the warlords' rough-hewn tents, a stark contrast to the grand, civic spaces of old. You would arrive with your offerings, your back aching from the journey, your heart heavy with resentment and fear. What you brought was not coins. Coins, if they were found, were curiosities, heirlooms, or simply bits of metal to be melted down for some crude purpose. They held no value in the immediate exchange of survival. Instead, you brought sacks of barley, carefully measured out from your family's precious store. You brought a handful of eggs, still warm from the hens, perhaps a scrawny sheep, its bleating a mournful protest as it was led away. The atmosphere at the collection point was thick with tension. Other villagers, their faces equally grim, stood in hesitant clusters, their own tribute laid out before them. The air was filled with the lowing of cattle, the rustle of sacks, the quiet, anxious murmurs of the peasants, and the harsh, guttural commands of the warlords' men. These men were armed, their expressions hard, their eyes constantly scanning, wary of any resistance, any sign of deceit. The captain, a hulking figure with a scarred face and a heavy, iron-bound sword at his hip, presided over the collection. He sat on a makeshift throne, often a repurposed stone block from some ancient monument, observing the proceedings with a cold, appraising gaze. His scribe, a nervous younger man, perhaps one of the few who still possessed the skill of rudimentary literacy, scratched crude tally marks onto a piece of scraped animal hide, recording each offering with meticulous, if brutal, efficiency. When it was your turn, you stepped forward, your heart thumping a heavy rhythm against your ribs. Your husband placed the sacks of grain before the captain, his expression stoic, unreadable. The captain's men would roughly inspect the offerings, plunging their hands into the sacks to feel the grain, prodding the sheep with their spears. They were looking for any sign of poor quality, any attempt to shortchange their master. Their contempt for the peasants was palpable, a constant current beneath the surface of the enforced order. There was no negotiation, no appeal. The demand had been made, and it had to be met. To argue, to resist, was to invite swift and brutal retribution. You had seen it before, a hut burned, a family scattered, a man publicly beaten as a grim example. So you complied with the quiet, deep-seated resignation of those who know they have no other choice. As the last of your family's tribute was accepted, a small, bitter taste of relief washed over you. The ordeal was over for now. You were free to return to your hut, to whatever meagre stores remained, to resume the endless struggle for sustenance. But the cost was heavy. You would know hunger in the lean months, a deeper, more profound gnawing in your stomach. The children would grow a little thinner. The winter would bite with an added fierceness. The tribute paid was not just a portion of your harvest, it was a portion of your future, a piece of your family's vitality. It was the crushing weight of obligation to a power that offered little in return beyond a temporary cessation of violence. It was the stark reality of life in a world without law, without a central authority to protect the weak from the strong. As you walked away from the collection point, the sounds of the warlord's camp fading behind you, the raucous laughter of the men, the distant clatter of their weapons, the mournful bleating of the captive animals, the silence of the crumbling Roman roads felt even heavier. The sun, once a symbol of Roman order and prosperity, now beat down on a landscape of diminished hopes and endless struggle. You carried the empty sacks, a tangible symbol of your loss, but also of your survival. You had paid the price. You had endured. And as you made your way back to your humble hut among the ruins, the image of your diminished stores and the knowledge of the hungry days ahead would burn into your mind, a constant reminder that in this new, hard world, the price of survival was exacted again and again in sacks of barley and the soft, trembling flesh of sheep. Hunger, sickness, and memory. The plague returns. In a world stripped of its former medical knowledge, where public sanitation had dissolved and people huddled together in squalor, illness was not merely a threat, it was a terrifying, almost mystical force. And chief among these terrors, a lingering ancient shadow that periodically resurfaced, was the plague. Its return was whispered in hushed tones, a word that could drain the color from a face, a name that struck more fear than any bandit or warlord. The first signs were subtle, easily dismissed in a community already accustomed to coughs, fevers, and aches. A persistent cough in one of the neighboring huts. A child growing listless, its eyes dull and feverish. But then the signs would become unmistakable, horrifyingly familiar, from the stories of elders who remembered previous outbreaks, or from the grim tales brought by passing peddlers. The sudden, inexplicable swellings in the armpits or groin, the buboes, dark and angry, burning with an inner fire. The rapidly escalating fever, the delirium, the blackening of the skin. The speed of its progression was terrifying. One day a person might complain of a headache, the next they might be writhing in agony, the day after they might be gone. The plague did not respect social standing. It swept through Lord's Hall and peasant's hut with equal, indiscriminate fury. But in the squalid, overcrowded conditions of the peasant settlements, where clean water was scarce and waste management non-existent, its spread was catastrophic. Streets, if they could be called that, were often little more than mud-slick paths, shared with animals, choked with refuse. These were breeding grounds for the vermin that often carried the disease, though the people themselves knew nothing of such connections, only of its devastating, swift mortality. Panic was a silent, internal scream. Doors would be quickly barred, despite the futility. People would avoid touching, avoid looking too long at a sick neighbor, even as their deepest instincts screamed for compassion. But fear was a stronger master. Every cough from a family member, every unexpected chill, became a source of agonizing dread. Prayer, once a source of comfort, often felt unanswered. The priest, if one was nearby, would risk his own life to administer last rites, his face grim, his voice heavy with despair. But his blessings could not stop the relentless march of the disease. People would turn to charms, to ancient folk remedies, to desperate whispered incantations, anything to ward off the invisible killer. Bundles of herbs would be hung above doors, foul-smelling poultices applied, but nothing seemed to halt its progress. The sick would be isolated, if possible, in a corner of the hut or a separate, crude shelter, visited only by the bravest or most desperate family members. The sounds from these places were haunting, the rasping breaths, the fevered moans, the chilling, ragged silence that eventually followed. Death became a constant, visible presence. Bodies, rapidly succumbing to the disease, would be laid out, often with little ceremony, wrapped in their thin blankets. The customary mourning rituals would be curtailed, hurried. The fear of contagion outweighed the solemnity of tradition. Burial would be swift, often in shallow graves outside the village, marked by a simple stone or nothing at all. The earth seemed to swallow the forgotten with an insatiable hunger. The toll was devastating. Families were decimated, children were orphaned, left to the tenuous care of other struggling relatives, or abandoned to the mercy of a world that had little to give. The already fragile fabric of the community would be stretched to its breaking point, and sometimes beyond. Entire villages would fall silent, their huts standing empty, monuments to the disease's brutal passage. As the plague subsided, as it always eventually did, leaving behind a scarred and diminished population, a heavy pall would hang over the survivors. The air would still feel thick with sorrow, with memory, with the silent question of why. The ruins outside, once merely a backdrop, now seemed to mirror the emptiness within, the gaping holes in the community. The plague's return was more than just a sickness, it was a profound trauma, a reminder of the raw, brutal fragility of life in a fallen world. It stripped away illusions of control, of security. It was a constant, terrifying echo of the deeper breakdown, a world where the very elements of survival, clean streets, effective medicine, a sense of collective protection, had evaporated, leaving ordinary people exposed and vulnerable to the most ancient and most terrifying of scourges. And the silence of its passing, though a relief, carried the lingering dread that, like the seasons, it would inevitably return. The village healer. In a world devoid of physicians, where grand Roman hospitals were forgotten structures, and medical texts were locked away in distant monasteries, the village healer was a crucial, often revered figure. She, for it was often a woman possessing ancient knowledge passed down through generations, stood between the living and the dead, a fragile bulwark against the relentless tide of illness and injury. Her tools were not scalpel and suture, but herbs, charms, and the potent, enduring power of whispered hope. Her dwelling was often set slightly apart from the other huts, perhaps at the edge of the village or in a quieter corner of the ruins. It was not a place of mystery or fear, but of practicality and reverence. You would seek her out when a child burned with fever, when a bone was broken, when a persistent cough threatened to consume a loved one. The journey to her door was often a desperate one, a last resort when all other prayers seemed to have gone unanswered. As you approached her hut, you might notice the carefully tended patch of earth beside it, even in the harshest season. Here she cultivated her precious herbs, bitter wormwood for fevers, soothing chamomile for troubled sleep, sharp garlic for infections, and a host of other plants whose names and properties were known only to her. The air around her dwelling often carried a complex aroma, the damp earth, the ever-present wood smoke, and the potent, sometimes pungent scent of drying herbs. Stepping inside her low-ceilinged hut, the air was warm, thick, and filled with a potent mixture of smells. Hanging from the rafters were bundles of dried herbs, their leaves rustling gently in the draughts. Small clay pots and wooden bowls lined shelves holding powders, salves, and infusions. Animal bladders, carefully sealed, contained viscous liquids or precious rendered fats. On a rough-hewn table, a mortar and pestle often sat, ready for the slow, rhythmic grinding of roots and leaves. The healer herself was often an older woman, her face a roadmap of hard-won experience. Her hands, though gnarled, moved with a surprising delicacy, her eyes sharp and knowing. She spoke little, but listened intently, her gaze piercing, taking in not just the symptoms, but the overall demeanor, the subtle signs of deeper distress. There was a quiet authority in her presence, born of generations of practical knowledge and an intimate understanding of the human body and the natural world. She would examine the ailing one with a gentle touch, feeling the heat of a forehead, listening to the wheeze of lungs, palpating a swollen limb. Her remedies were drawn from the earth around her, from the traditions passed down through her lineage. She might brew a bitter tea from specific roots, or fashion a poultice from crushed leaves and warm mud. She might apply leeches to draw bad blood, or set a broken bone with crude splints and bindings, her touch surprisingly firm. But her healing was not just of the body, it was also of the spirit. She understood the deep-seated fears that gripped people in this fractured world. She would murmur incantations, ancient blessings whispered over the smoky air, often blending Christian prayers with older, pagan charms that spoke to the deeper, primal fears of a pre-scientific age. She would offer amulet, a piece of consecrated wood, a smooth stone, a small bag of protective herbs, to be worn close to the skin. These charms, though offering no physical cure, provided a vital psychological comfort, a sense of agency against the terrifying randomness of disease. Her fee was always in kind, a measure of grain, a fresh egg, a piece of spun wool, or a promise of labor during harvest. Her service was essential, and though her remedies were often simple, they were all that stood between her people and the ravages of sickness. Sometimes she succeeded. A fever would break, a wound would heal, a life would be saved. These were celebrated as small miracles, reinforcing her status and the community's fragile hope. More often, she failed, not through lack of effort or knowledge, but because the illnesses were too severe, the bodies too weakened by hunger, the knowledge too incomplete. She would sit by the dying, offering comfort and prayers, her face etched with a quiet sorrow, understanding that some battles could not be won. Her role was also to ease the passage, to provide what small dignity she could in the face of inevitable death. As you left her hut, carrying a small, wrapped bundle of pungent herbs or a clay pot of bitter-smelling salve, a sense of quiet hope would flicker within you. You might not fully understand the precise workings of her remedies, but you trusted in her knowledge, in her dedication, in the ancient wisdom she embodied. The village healer was a living bridge between the lost knowledge of Rome and the brutal realities of the present. She represented humanity's enduring struggle to understand and master its own vulnerabilities. Her herbs, charms, and whispered hope were the only defense against the unseen enemies that lurked in the damp earth, in the cold air, in the very fabric of life itself. And in her quiet strength, there was a profound testament to the enduring human need for healing, for comfort, for a glimmer of light in the overwhelming shadows of despair. The grave dug shallow. Death was a constant companion in this world, not a distant, abstract concept, but a frequent, intimate visitor. It came in many forms: the sudden violence of a bandit raid, the lingering cough that stole breath from the old, the swift, merciless sweep of the plague that claimed the young. And when it came, the rituals of mourning, once so elaborate and steeped in Roman tradition, were stripped bare, reduced to the raw, urgent necessity of the moment. The earth swallowed the forgotten, as bells, if they tolled at all, did so faintly, forlornly. The small plot of land designated for burials was not a grand necropolis or a meticulously kept cemetery. It was often a patch of uneven ground on the outskirts of the settlement, perhaps a slight rise overlooking the ruins, or a quiet space amidst a grove of ancient, gnarled trees. The ground was hard, often rocky, resistant to the spade, and offered little comfort. When a death occurred, there was little time for elaborate ceremony. The body, often emaciated and frail, would be washed with cold water, wrapped in the cleanest, most intact linen available, often just a threadbare blanket, and laid out in the hut for a brief period. The grief was profound but often suppressed, for too much open lamentation felt like a luxury, a weakening in a world that demanded constant fortitude. The digging of the grave was a grim communal task. Men, their faces grim and silent, would take up spades and picks, often crude and worn, and begin the arduous work. The earth was stubborn, resisting their efforts. Each stroke of the pick against stone, each shovelful of heavy, damp soil, was a physical manifestation of the communal grief and the harsh reality of their existence. The hole was not deep, not meticulously prepared. It was a grave dug shallow, just enough to cover the body, to return it to the earth before the elements, or scavengers, could claim it. There was no coffin, not typically. Timber was too precious, too necessary for building and fuel, to be wasted on the dead. The body would be lowered directly into the cold earth, wrapped in its simple shroud. A few stones might be placed on top, or a small wooden cross, hastily fashioned, to mark the spot. Sometimes, if the death had been swift and widespread, like during an outbreak of plague, there would be no markers at all, only a mound of freshly turned earth, destined to sink and vanish with the next heavy rain. The words spoken at the graveside were simple, heartfelt, and often drawn from the Christian faith that had taken root amongst the ruins. A prayer for the soul of the departed, a plea for mercy, a hope for resurrection. The priest, if he was present, would officiate, his voice solemn, his blessings offered to both the living and the dead. But often it was simply an elder, a father, a mother, murmuring words of farewell, their voices heavy with sorrow, carried away on the indifferent wind. The bells, if a church or monastery was nearby and still possessed a bell, would toll faintly, a slow, mournful sound that carried across the desolate landscape. It was a sound that marked the passage of a soul, but also an elegy for a world where such sounds were increasingly rare, increasingly subdued. Each toll echoed the profound silence that had descended upon so much of the once vibrant Roman world. As the earth was shoveled back into the grave, covering the simple shroud, the sound was dull and final. The villagers would stand in a small, tight cluster, their heads bowed, their faces stoic. There was no time for prolonged grief, not when the demands of the living were so pressing. Work called, the remaining children needed food, the fire needed fuel. Life, raw and unyielding, insisted on its continuation. The grave dug shallow was a stark reminder of the diminished value of individual life in an age of such overwhelming precarity. It spoke of a world where grand monuments were falling, but the fundamental, brutal cycles of birth and death continued, stripped of pomp and ceremony. It was a testament to the fact that in the shadow of a fallen empire, human existence was fragile, easily extinguished, and often quickly forgotten by all but the closest few. And as you turned away from the freshly turned earth, leaving the departed to the cold embrace of the ground, the chill wind would feel a little colder, the burden of living a little heavier. The earth swallowed the forgotten, and the faint tolling of bells served only to underscore the profound, sorrowful silence that had settled over a world without empire. The shuttered hut. As the last bruised colours of sunset bled from the sky, painting the broken arches of the distant aqueduct in fleeting shades of sorrow, a profound shift descended upon the world. The day, with its endless toil and its visible dangers, gave way to the night, a realm of deeper, more insidious fears. And as the darkness gathered, the first, most crucial act of survival was to shutter the hut, to draw the fragile boundaries between the known and the unknown, the safe and the terrifying. Your hut was not built for grandeur or defense, but for simple shelter. Its low, rough-hewn doorway, often just a gaping hole in the mud-daubed wall, was the most vulnerable point. As the light faded, your husband would carefully, deliberately, retrieve the heavy plank of wood that served as the primary door. It was a thick, unpolished slab, salvaged perhaps from a fallen Roman beam, its surface rough and scarred. With a grunting effort, he would wedge it into place, fitting it tightly into the rough frame of the doorway. The sound of the wood slotting into place was a small, satisfying thud, a declaration of intent. Then from inside he would slide the sturdy wooden bar across, a thick branch smoothed by use, fitting it into 2 deep notches on either side of the doorframe. The act was ancient, primal, a simple mechanical defiance against the unseen threats of the night. It was a prayer made manifest in timber. But the door was not the only vulnerability. The small, unglazed openings in the walls, high up near the eaves, served as rudimentary windows during the day, letting in precious light and air. Now they were dark holes, inviting the cold and, worse, prying eyes. These would be stuffed with bundles of straw or covered with scraps of hide, crudely tied or tacked into place. Each gap sealed, each crack plugged with mud or moss, was a small act of fortification, a desperate attempt to keep the night's manifold dangers at bay. The air inside the hut, once open to the chill, now grew still and thick, permeated by the familiar aromas of smoke, damp earth, and human presence. The small, flickering light of the hearth, a single eye of warmth in the encroaching gloom, became the heart of your small universe. Outside, the silence deepened, broken only by the distant mournful cry of an owl, or the whisper of the wind through the tall, dry grasses. Children, once restless, would huddle closer to the fire, their faces rapt, their eyes wide. They understood the unspoken rules of the night. The stories of wolves, of bandits, of other darker things that roamed the desolate lands were not mere tales. They were grim warnings given stark reality by the shuttered door and the flickering shadows. Your husband would check the bar again, testing its strength with a heavy hand. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was etched with a quiet vigilance, his ears constantly attuned to any unusual sound from outside. The knowledge that he was the protector, the sole bulwark against the night's dangers, was a heavy cloak he wore without complaint. The silence outside was often more unnerving than any definite sound. It was an empty, vast silence, full of unspoken possibilities. No watchman's call from a Roman tower, no distant chatter from a bustling vicus, no familiar sounds of a functioning, ordered world. Only the immense, indifferent quiet of the ruins, now cloaked in impenetrable darkness. Even the animals inside, the chickens in their corner, the dog, if you had one, curled by the hearth, seemed to sense the change. They would settle into a deeper quiet, their breathing shallow, their instincts attuned to the pervasive threat that lurked beyond the walls. Their presence, however, was also a small comfort, their warm bodies adding a fraction of heat, their senses a warning system. The fire, though low, was meticulously maintained. It was not just a source of warmth or light, it was a psychological barrier, a defiant spark against the all-encompassing darkness. Its glow cast long, dancing shadows that made the rough walls of the hut seem to shift and breathe, creating a confined but intensely vivid internal world. As you settled onto your straw bed, the weight of the night pressed in. You could feel the immense, cold presence of the ruins outside, their broken grandeur now shrouded, made ominous by the darkness. You could feel the fragile barrier of the shuttered hut, a thin shield against the vast unknown. You would close your eyes, not to sleep immediately, but to listen, to feel, to exist in that heightened state of awareness that was the constant companion of life in a fallen world. The shuttered hut was more than a physical space. It was a state of mind. It was a symbol of retreat, of drawing inward, of clinging to the small, vital warmth of family and hearth against a world that had become vast, dark, and dangerous. You wedged a plank, you hoped, and you waited for the slow, grudging promise of dawn, praying that wolves or men would stay away. Whispered stories. With the hut shuttered against the night and the fire glowing low, the world outside, with its visible dangers and its monumental ruins, receded. In its place, a smaller, more intimate world emerged, illuminated by the flickering embers. This was the time for stories, for the ancient ritual of spoken words shared in the darkness. Legends told in hushed tones, both comfort and warning, weaving a fragile tapestry of meaning and memory into the smoky air. The family would gather close around the hearth, the children nestled between their parents, seeking both physical warmth and the security of familiar voices. The light was too dim for any work, too precious to waste on tasks that could wait for the dawn. So they listened. Your husband, his voice a low rumble, would often be the storyteller. His face, etched with the day's toil, would take on a different aspect in the firelight, his eyes glinting with the effort of memory and imagination. He would speak of the old times of Rome, not as a glorious empire, but as a half-remembered legend, a vast, powerful city of marble and gold that existed only in the mists of ancestral tales. He might describe the aqueduct not as the broken skeleton you saw every day, but as a living river of water flowing miraculously over impossible distances, quenching the thirst of millions. He would speak of roads so smooth and straight that legions could march for weeks without breaking stride, of buildings that touched the clouds, of emperors who commanded armies larger than any warlord could dream of. These stories were a strange blend of fact and fantasy, distorted by generations of oral transmission, colored by the longing for a lost golden age. They were comfort, for they spoke of a time when order prevailed, when life was perhaps less brutal. But they were also a warning, a subtle reminder of how far the world had fallen, how fleeting even the grandest achievements could be. The children listened, their eyes wide, their imaginations populating the silent, broken stones outside with the ghosts of a vanished past. They would never see that Rome, only its mournful ruins, but through these stories they touched a piece of its former glory. But not all stories were of distant empire. Many were of more immediate, visceral concerns. Tales of cunning wolves, their eyes glowing red in the darkness, outsmarted by a brave shepherd. Stories of bandits, their cruelty and greed, detailed in chilling whispers, serving as a grim lesson to stay close to home, to be wary of strangers on the road. These were tales designed to instill caution, to teach the harsh lessons of survival through narrative. Sometimes they were tales of saints brought by the itinerant priest or remembered from the days when churches were more numerous and their teachings more pervasive. Stories of humble men and women who performed miracles, who stood defiant against oppression, who offered hope in the face of despair. These were stories of moral fortitude, of spiritual resilience, a balm for the weary soul. And often, too, there were family stories of grandparents and great-grandparents, of their struggles, their small triumphs, their quiet endurance. These were the most immediate legends tying the current generation to a long, unbroken chain of survival, a lineage of strength in hardship. They were reminders that you were not alone in your struggle, that others before you had faced similar hungers, similar fears, and had found a way to persist. The sounds in the hut were hushed, the low, steady murmur of the storyteller's voice, the soft crackle of the embers, the quiet breathing of the sleeping child, perhaps the distant creak of the wind through the eaves. Each sound contributed to the intimate, contained world created by the stories. As the tales unwound, the boundaries between the real and the imagined blurred. The darkness outside the hut felt less menacing, transformed into a canvas for the mind's eye. The cold of the night seemed less pervasive, warmed by the shared presence and the communal act of listening. The power of these whispered stories was immense. They were not just entertainment, they were education, history, moral instruction, and psychological solace, all wrapped into one. They were how knowledge was passed, how values were reinforced, how a sense of identity was maintained in a world that sought to strip it away. As the fire burned lower and the stories drew to a close, a sense of quiet calm would settle over the hut. The children, their minds filled with images of emperors and wolves, of saints and ancestors, would drift off to sleep, their small bodies warm beside their parents. The adults, too, would feel the heavy pull of exhaustion, their minds having briefly escaped the immediate anxieties of survival into the richer, more complex landscapes of legend. The whispered stories, told in the darkness by the flicker of embers, were a small, defiant act of humanity. They were a testament to the enduring power of narrative, a way to make sense of a chaotic world, to pass on the wisdom of the past, and to find both comfort and warning in the profound stillness of a night without empire. The flicker of embers. The stories had faded into sleep, the last whispers consumed by the encroaching silence. The children lay in tangled heaps, their breathing soft and rhythmic. Your husband, his face a shadowed mask of weariness, had also finally surrendered to the heavy pull of exhaustion beside you. The world outside the shuttered hut was an inky, absolute black, broken only by the vast, indifferent spread of stars that burned like scattered dust above the silent ruins. But within the hut, a single, tenacious heart still beat, the fire reduced now to a low, orange flicker of embers. It was not a roaring blaze, not even a cheerful flame. It was a dying breath, a tenacious glow at the heart of the hearth, a collection of red and orange coals that pulsed with a faint inner light. Yet this humble glow was everything. It was the last visible link to warmth, to light, to life itself in the profound darkness of the deepest night. You lay awake, listening. The sounds of the night were amplified in the stillness. The distant, mournful howl of a wolf, a stark reminder of the wild, predatory world that pressed in from all sides. The softer rustle of a rat in the thatch above, or the faint, scuttling sound in the walls, a persistent, unwelcome presence. And, always, the wind, a restless spirit, sighing through the cracks in the mud-daubed walls, whispering through the gaps in the thatch, a cold breath that sought to invade your fragile sanctuary. The embers cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and shrank across the rough, smoke-stained walls. They transformed the familiar shapes of your hut into something subtly unsettling. The crude stool became a crouching beast. The hanging tools became menacing figures. It was a world of ghosts and half-seen things, born of the interplay between faint light and profound darkness. You watched the embers, mesmerized by their slow, deliberate dying. Each tiny spark that leaped briefly from the heart of a coal was a miniature universe, born and extinguished in an instant. They were a microcosm of life itself in this fallen world, fragile, fleeting, but persistent. The smell of wood smoke, old and comforting, mingled with the damp earth and the subtle scent of sleeping bodies, creating the unique perfume of your enduring home. The cold was pervasive, a constant, insidious enemy that sought to steal the warmth from your body. You pulled the coarse wool blanket tighter around your shoulders, trying to huddle deeper into the straw. But the embers, however faint, offered a psychological comfort that transcended their actual heat. They were a promise, a beacon, for a fire never truly died, not if it was properly tended. It merely slept. These embers were not the end, but a bridge. With careful hands and a few small pieces of dry kindling, they could be coaxed back to life in the morning, transformed once more into a leaping flame that would banish the morning chill, boil the meagre pottage, and offer another day's brief respite. They were the continuity, the thread that connected one day's struggle to the next. Your thoughts drifted, unbidden, through the anxieties of the past day and the looming uncertainties of the morrow. The warlord's demands, the gnawing hunger, the shadow of sickness, the constant struggle to keep your family safe and fed. These worries, usually held at bay by the demands of daylight, now pressed in with the weight of the dark. But as you gazed at the flickering heart of the embers, a deeper, more primal feeling would rise. It was the ancient, enduring human connection to fire, to its warmth, its light, its power to create and destroy. It was a feeling of quiet endurance, of stubborn persistence. Despite everything, the fire still glowed. You closed your eyes, then opened them again, watching the embers. They were the heartbeat of the hut, a slow, steady pulse against the vast cold indifference of the universe. They represented hope, however faint. They represented the unyielding will to survive, to coax life from the shadows. And as the last tiny flickers danced across your weary eyelids, you held on to that image. The fire never truly died, but glowed faintly, waiting for dawn. It was a quiet, profound promise in the heart of a night without empire, a testament to the enduring power of a single, persistent spark in a world consumed by shadow. And slowly, finally, the deep exhaustion would claim you, drawing you into a fitful sleep, warmed by the knowledge that the embers, like your own spirit, still held a fragile, tenacious glow. The weight of the roof. The darkness of the deepest night pressed in, thick and absolute, a tangible presence that settled over the hut like a heavy shroud. The fire, now merely a faint memory of embers, offered little light, and the world was reduced to the immediate, intimate sensations of sound and touch. And in that profound stillness, the relentless, insidious sound of water began its unwelcome intrusion. The drip, drip, drip of rain seeping through the fragile thatch of the roof. The roof was not a grand, tiled structure of Roman design, but a pragmatic, hastily constructed affair. Layers of straw, reeds, and branches gathered from the surrounding wilderness, woven together and laid over a framework of salvaged timber. It was a constant battle to keep it sound, to mend the holes, to prevent the elements from reclaiming what little shelter it offered. But even the most diligent repairs were temporary. The elements, patient and relentless, always found a way. The first drop was barely audible, a soft, almost imperceptible plink against a piece of pottery on the floor. Then another, and another. Soon a slow, rhythmic cadence began, each drop echoing with a disquieting clarity in the profound silence of the hut. It was a sound that spoke of vulnerability, of the constant erosion of your precarious security. You lay on your straw bed, pulling the rough blanket tighter, trying to ignore the insistent rhythm. But the sound, once heard, was impossible to unhear. Each drip was a separate, chilling announcement of the outside world's intrusion. You could almost feel the cold, damp touch of the water, even through the layers of thatch and timber. The rain was not just water. It was the weight of the wild, pressing down on your fragile shelter. It spoke of the constant struggle against decay, against the slow, inexorable return of the land to its natural state. The thatched roof, once a symbol of protection, now felt like a sieve struggling against an overwhelming tide. Sometimes the drips would be few and far between, a minor irritation. Other times, the rain would become a deluge, and the drips would multiply, a scattered chorus of liquid percussion. You would hear the splash of a larger drop hitting the mud floor with a wet smack, or the soft, insidious sound of water soaking into the straw just inches from your sleeping head. There was little to be done in the dead of night. To venture outside in the driving rain to attempt repairs was folly, a greater danger than the water itself. So, you endured it, listening, waiting. You might shift your position, pulling your family closer together, trying to find a dry spot on the damp straw. Sometimes a strategically placed pot or bowl would catch the worst of it, its hollow clang amplifying each drop, transforming the nuisance into a persistent, maddening drumbeat. The smell of damp earth and wet thatch would become stronger, mingling with the other familiar aromas of the hut. It was a smell that spoke of the persistent humidity, of the constant battle against moisture, against the insidious growth of mildew and rot that plagued all aspects of your dwelling. The sounds of the rain outside were constant, the ceaseless drumming on the thatch, the rush of water along the walls, the steady gurgle of unseen streams. But it was the inside drips that truly unnerved, the violation of your inner sanctuary. Each drop was a cold finger touching your fragile sense of security. You would listen too for the effect on your children. A slight rustle from a sleeping form, a small whimper, a shift in breathing. You would reach out in the darkness, feeling their small, warm bodies, reassuring yourself that the water had not reached them, that they were still dry and safe beneath their thin blankets. Their innocent sleep, undisturbed by the anxieties of the roof, was a precious, fragile thing to protect. The weight of the roof, both literal and metaphorical, felt immense in those moments. It was the weight of responsibility, of the constant vigilance required to maintain even this humble shelter against a world that sought to break it down. It was the constant battle against the forces of nature, against the decay that had consumed so much of the grand Roman world. As the hours dragged on and the rain continued its relentless assault, the drips would persist, each drop echoing in the silence, a profound and intimate reminder of your vulnerability. You would long for the dawn, for the pale grey light that would allow you to assess the damage, to gather the materials, to begin the endless task of mending once more. The rain dripped through thatch, each drop a resonant echo in the profound silence of a night without empire, a relentless testament to the constant, weary struggle to keep the world outside from intruding too deeply into the fragile sanctuary of your humble, enduring home. Dawn again. The night, with its vast darkness, its creeping cold, and its whispered fears, always, eventually, surrendered. The change was not sudden, but a gradual, almost imperceptible softening of the impenetrable black. It began as a faint, bruised purple at the very edge of the eastern sky, a mere suggestion of light that slowly, grudgingly, pushed back the oppressive gloom. And then, from the depths of the profound stillness, came the sound, the ragged, defiant crow of the rooster. It was not a proud, resonant call, but a raw, unpolished cry, breaking the silence with its insistent declaration of a new day. It was the sound of life, tenacious and unyielding, stubbornly persisting in a world that had forgotten its former glories. The rooster, a scrawny bird sharing your hut, or perhaps one from a neighbour's enclosure, was the village's unofficial timepiece, its call an ancient, reliable signal that the long vigil was over. You stirred, your body protesting the movement with its familiar aches. The straw beneath you was damp, perhaps a little more so from the night's rain, and clung to your clothes. Your muscles were stiff, your mind still clouded with the lingering worries of the dark. But the rooster's call was an order, an unyielding command to rise, to face the day's relentless demands. As the first sliver of grey light filtered through the cracks in the mud-daubed walls, through the gaps in the shuttered door, the shapes of the hut began to coalesce. The rough-hewn timbers, the packed earth floor, the dim outlines of your sleeping family. The air, though still cold, felt subtly lighter, carrying with it a faint promise of warmth that the new sun would eventually bring. Your breath still plumed faintly in the frigid air, but it felt less like ghost smoke and more like a visible affirmation of life, of a body still capable of enduring. The embers in the hearth, though faint, still glowed, a persistent orange heart at the core of your home, waiting to be coaxed back into flame. The shuttered plank door, which had felt like a fortress against the night's terrors, now seemed merely a barrier to be removed, a threshold to be crossed. Your husband would begin the process, groaning softly as he shifted the heavy bar, his hands calloused from endless labor. The sound of the plank being unbarred and pushed aside was a liberation, allowing the full grey light of dawn to seep into the hut, pushing back the lingering shadows. The outside world, once a terrifying void, was now revealed in its familiar, stark reality. The monumental ruins, standing like silent sentinels, were still broken, still majestic in their decay. The crumbling Roman roads stretched out, leading to nothing but the fields that demanded your toil. The sky above was vast, indifferent, but now painted with the subtle, emerging colours of a new day. Pale blues, soft greys, a hint of hesitant rose at the distant horizon. The children, stirred by the light and the sounds, would begin to wake, their small bodies stretching, their eyes blinking against the muted dawn. They would demand food, and the cycle would begin anew. The coarse bread, the thin pottage, the endless quest for sustenance. You would rise, shake the straw from your clothes, and feel the cold reality of the earth beneath your bare feet. There was no joy in this rising, not a light-heartedness. But there was a deep-seated, quiet determination. The night had passed. You had endured. Your family had survived another turning of the world. The ruins of Rome still stood, monuments to a vanished glory, indifferent to the daily struggle for existence. But the people, ordinary people like you, persisted. The wind still whispered through the cracks, the rain still threatened the thatch, the hunger still gnawed, but the sun inevitably always rose. And as the light seeped further through cracks, illuminating the familiar, humble interior of your hut, the rhythm of life, ancient and unbroken, began once more. The rooster called again, a renewed declaration of the enduring present. The cycle began anew, not with fanfare or triumph, but with the quiet, persistent, unyielding strength of those who simply found a way to survive, one dawn at a time, in a world that had forgotten its empire.